In 2017, Australia's official strategy to rescue a critical island outpost was to release a massive swarm of exotic wasps into the forest canopy. On purpose. For a nation with a long, painful memory of biological interventions, most notoriously turning cane toads loose to combat beetles, only to unleash an ecological disaster across the north, the plan looked like pure madness on paper. But the ecosystem was collapsing. Millions of native red crabs were dying to an invasive ant no chemical could wipe out. 2 decades of spreading toxic bait had achieved virtually nothing, and time was running out. Yet the wasp earmarked for release was different. It doesn't sting, doesn't build nests, and targets exactly one host. I'm Ambrose Wild, and the central mechanism of this ecological rescue is routinely misunderstood. The wasp is not a killer. In 8 years on that island, the wasp has never touched a single ant dot. To understand why, you have to start with the crabs. Christmas Island is a tropical limestone outpost in the Indian Ocean, covering 135 square kilometers, about the size of Norfolk Island. Red crabs live here and nowhere else on Earth. Every year, when the wet season arrives, tens of millions of them leave their burrows simultaneously and march to the sea. Roads are closed, land managers construct dedicated crab bridges over highways, and observers gather to watch the forest floor turn into a moving red carpet dot. Then came the ants. Yellow crazy ants arrived silently on shipping vessels between 1915 and 1934. Biologists still don't know where the species originally came from, an anomaly for an insect this destructive. What rangers quickly learned was what happens when it invades an environment with no natural checks. Yet here is the first thing the story gets wrong. The ants are not hunting the crabs. Yellow crazy ants have no sting. What they have is a gland that sprays formic acid indiscriminately. A crab walking through colony territory gets sprayed in its eyes and joints, loses its orientation, and dies within hours as the acid burns its breathing tissue. The ants barely touch the body. The crabs are not prey, they are collateral damage, killed by an aggressive invader defending food the crabs were never competing for. Tens of millions have perished since the 1990s. Which raises a glaring question. If formic acid is such an absolute weapon, why does anything survive? The answer comes down to water. The island's other prominent crustacean, the blue crab, lives along freshwater coastal creeks and must soak daily. Crazy ants avoid running water entirely, allowing a sprayed blue crab to simply wash away the acid and survive. A red crab, bound strictly to the dry forest floor, has no such escape. So why can this particular ant inflict such massive damage when thousands of other ant species cannot? The answer took field researchers years to unravel, and it is fundamentally bizarre. Most ant species are ferociously territorial with their own kind. 2 neighboring nests of the same species will wage war at their boundary, a constant conflict that keeps populations naturally self-limiting. Yellow crazy ants do not fight. Biologists classify them as unicolonial. An ant taken from one nest and dropped into another kilometers away is not attacked as a rival. It is welcomed as family. Because these colonies never fight, they waste no energy defending borders and never stop expanding outward. What you get is not a series of individual ant nests, but a single, continuous supercolony with thousands of queens and millions of workers spreading across the landscape like an oil slick. One supercolony surveyed on the island in 2002 spanned close to 36,000 hectares. Imagine an unbroken carpet of stinging ants covering an area larger than the entire city footprint of Adelaide, operating as one massive machine. This was the engine behind a 20-year war that land managers simply could not win. The chemical eradication program launched in 2001. The primary weapon was a protein-based bait laced with fipronil, a potent neurotoxin. Field teams carried it into the bush on foot, scattering it into the heart of known supercolonies, and when state conservation budgets permitted, aerial teams dropped it by helicopter over the dense forest canopy. Rangers walked into zones crawling with over 1,000 ants per square meter to lay down poisoned food. At first, it worked. Supercolonies collapsed overnight, and red crabs ventured back onto treated ground. But within a few seasons, hidden pockets of ants emerged from inaccessible gullies and limestone sinkholes that ground crews could never reach. The invasion restarted instantly. Chemical baiting was a costly subscription, not a cure. Every hectare had to be retreated. Every ranger hour had to be paid for again. The ants, meanwhile, reproduced for free. Any environmental strategy reliant on annual budget lines will eventually be outlasted by an invasive pest that runs on raw biological drive. There was another severe drawback to fipronil that official press releases tended to gloss over. Fipronil is not a targeted ant poison. It is a broad-spectrum invertebrate neurotoxin. In an ecosystem where native land crabs and terrestrial invertebrates form the baseline of the food web, carpet bombing the forest with a non-selective poison carries immense collateral risk. That is why baiting was strictly restricted to areas exceeding high ant density thresholds, and only during the dry season, when red crabs were sealed safely inside their underground burrows. Chemical baiting was never popular with local communities, who watched toxic compounds drop over their pristine bushland year after year. Seeking a cleaner mechanism, researchers at Trobe University stopped trying to poison the ants directly and began dissecting their food chain instead. A massive supercolony requires enormous amounts of energy. Millions of active workers need continuous carbohydrates, and on this island, almost all of that fuel comes from a single source: the yellow lac-scale insect. These tiny, sap-sucking agricultural pests, also introduced from abroad, cluster along tree branches, drinking plant sap and excreting a concentrated sugar liquid known as honeydew. The ants harvest this liquid constantly. In return, they guard the scale insects from native predators like livestock, driving a mutualistic expansion across the entire island. Cut that sugar supply, and the supercolony collapses from starvation. In controlled field trials where crazy ants were denied access to honeydew, ant numbers on the ground plummeted by 80% within weeks, not because a poison killed them, but because a colony without fuel cannot hold ground. Reframe the entire rescue operation around that single fact. Nothing in Australia's modern management plan relies on killing an ant. Land managers stopped spraying the supercolonies directly. They ignored the ants and targeted their grocery store. Which brings us to the micro-wasp. In Southeast Asia, where the yellow lac-scale insect is native, it is an obscure, harmless creature because its populations are suppressed by a microscopic parasitoid wasp known as Tachardiaephagus somervillei. Barely 2 millimeters long, smaller than a grain of rice, this tiny insect does exactly one thing. It locates a female scale insect, lays up to 8 eggs inside her body, and the emerging larvae consume her from the inside out. A single wasp can destroy over 150 scale insects in its brief life. In tropical Asia, up to 90% of scale insects are parasitized by this insect. It does not sting, builds no nests, and poses zero risk to humans, livestock, or agricultural crops. There is one critical detail that sensationalized reports consistently miss, and it provides the strongest justification for the program. This tiny wasp was already present on the island, having arrived accidentally decades earlier in numbers far too small to establish control. Australia was not releasing a dangerous foreign predator into a fragile habitat. It was boosting a biocontrol agent that had already arrived but failed to hit critical mass. A parasitoid can only suppress its host when its population is dense enough to find almost every scale insect in the canopy. Reaching that saturation point was the entire strategy. If you have followed any history of biological control in Australia, your immediate reaction to releasing a new insect into the wild is skepticism. And that skepticism is entirely justified. In 1935, agricultural authorities released cane toads to eat greyback beetles in Queensland cane fields. The toads ignored the beetles, bred rapidly across the north, and poisoned apex predators from quolls to freshwater crocodiles. Decades earlier, mongooses were introduced to sugarcane islands to kill rats, which failed because rats are nocturnal and mongooses hunt by day. A basic biological mismatch nobody bothers to test. That track record explains why locals and conservation groups treated the proposed release with immense suspicion. But comparing a pre-war introduction to a modern biocontrol project misses how rigorous federal environmental law has become. The work on the micro-wasp began in 2009. To guarantee the wasp would not jump to non-target species, researchers conducted exhaustive host specificity trials over several years in Malaysian field sites, testing the wasp against 8 closely related sap-sucking insects. None were harmed. The definitive test was the forced no-choice assessment. Wasps were isolated with non-target native species and given no alternative food or host. A parasitoid that refuses to lay eggs under those conditions is biologically incapable of shifting hosts. Scientists also verified that the wasps could function while aggressive crazy ants actively patrolled the branches. The ants' presence made no difference. The wasps bypassed the bodyguards effortlessly. Following years of rigorous quarantine checks and formal public reviews under federal biosecurity frameworks, approval was granted. Starting with a founder stock of just 300 wasps imported from Malaysia, breeding facilities produced tens of thousands of individuals over 3 years before releasing them into the forest canopy. So did the experiment work? The answer depends on which clock you are watching. On the ecological microclock, the impact was almost instantaneous. As scale insect populations crashed, honeydew production ceased, and ant activity on the ground collapsed within weeks. Land managers walking through former supercolonies recorded ant counts plummeting from hundreds per square meter to single digits. Red crabs immediately began digging burrows in dirt that had been an active ant city days before. But on the macro clock of population recovery, progress is slow. Red crabs take years to mature, and their famous migration relies on unpredictable monsoonal rain patterns. It took nearly a decade before the red crab migration was once again described as a massive annual phenomenon. And even today, that recovery remains vulnerable to weather extremes. In recent seasons, when the monsoonal rains arrived late, the migration barely materialized because the crabs remained underground to avoid dehydration. The biological suppression was immediate. The landscape's full recovery is a long-term process. Both statements are true, though only the quick win fits into a media headline. Meanwhile, scientists are already planning a second front in this biological war. Since 2021, environmental agencies have been researching another micro-wasp species, sourced from Africa, aimed at a secondary scale insect farmed by the ants. The complication is that Australian agricultural authorities classify that particular scale species as a potential crop pest on the mainland, keeping final regulatory approval stalled on paper. And none of this means the island escaped unscathed. The island has already suffered irreversible losses. The Christmas Island pipistrelle, a tiny native bat weighing no more than a coin, vanished entirely and was declared extinct in 2009. The forest skink, once the most abundant reptile across the island, experienced a catastrophic crash. Biologists recall counting dozens along a single fallen log in the late 1990s. By the late 2000s, an exhaustive island-wide search located just 3 surviving females. The last known individual died in captivity on May 31, 2014. In 2017, the same year the wasps were unleashed, the species was formally declared extinct, marking the first documented Australian reptile extinction since European settlement. Yellow crazy ants were not the sole cause of these extinctions, and blaming them exclusively would be scientifically dishonest. But a rainforest infested with millions of acid-spraying ants is a brutal landscape where small ground-dwelling animals are scorched alive every time they cross open terrain. The ecological correlation is impossible to ignore. Which brings us to the counterintuitive reality of a healthy rainforest floor. Red crabs act as the primary forest cleaners. They devour leaf litter, graze back weed seedlings, and constantly turn over the soil. Take them away, and organic matter piles up into rotting layers. Non-native plants choke out indigenous flora, and invasive giant African land snails move in. Without millions of crab burrows acting as a natural drainage system, the soil compacts into hard clay. A healthy tropical rainforest in this region isn't a tangled jungle. It features bare, dark earth kept clean by millions of foraging crabs. The overgrown green tangle is actually a dying ecosystem in cardiac arrest. Which brings us to the final question in invasive pest management. Can you ever completely eradicate yellow crazy ants from an ecosystem? The surprising answer is yes. It has been achieved once, on a remote oceanic outpost in the Pacific called Johnston Atoll, located roughly 1,400 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. Once a military weapons testing facility, the atoll is now a protected wildlife sanctuary, hosting tens of thousands of seabirds that nest on open ground without natural predators. When yellow crazy ants established themselves around 2010, spraying acid at chicks and adults alike, the world's largest breeding colony of red-tailed tropic birds faced immediate devastation. In 2014, conservation scientists launched an intense eradication campaign. Over nearly a decade, around 100 staff and volunteers logged more than 130,000 hours in the field, systematically baiting and hand-hunting every remaining nest across the island. In December 2020, 2 detector dogs trained specifically to locate yellow crazy ants swept 190 kilometers of terrain and detected no living ants. The species was officially declared eradicated, the first successful elimination of an invasive ant at that scale on record. Yet that brute force strategy can never be replicated on Christmas Island. Johnston Atoll consists of just 2.5 square kilometers of flat, low scrub that a ranger can walk across in a single afternoon. Christmas Island encompasses 135 square kilometers of dense tropical rainforest, vertical limestone cliffs, and impenetrable sinkholes. Manual ground eradication simply cannot scale to a landscape of that size and complexity, and every land manager involved in the project acknowledged it from the start. Which is precisely why a 2 mm micro-wasp that reproduces for free, multiplying forever through a high forest canopy no ground crew could ever reach, was worth all 8 years of rigorous scientific trials and regulatory delay. The war for the island's future is far from over. Yellow crazy ants still exist in low densities, and new biosecurity risks constantly threaten isolated habitats across the region. But for the first time since the invasion began in the 1990s, the mechanism holding the pest in check doesn't depend on an annual government grant, a taxpayer line item, or a helicopter fuel budget. It relies on the quiet, relentless power of targeted biological control. I'm Ambrose Wild, and if you want to understand more cases where the natural solution turns out to be far stranger than the ecological disaster, subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the hidden mechanics shaping our wild places.